13th of November, 1942. Sound of the Iron Bottom, Solomon Islands. Captain Tameichi Hara, commander of the destroyer Amatsukaze, watched the American gusts cross the night like lightning bolts of steel. In his diary, he wrote a sentence that left no room for metaphors. They don't aim, they only fill the sky with fire. What seemed out of control to Japanese officers revealed an unknown, or worse, unthinkable doctrine: shoot without counting. This apparent irrationality hid America's true weapon in the Pacific. It was not a ship nor a plan. It was the industry. The ability to turn copper into capsules, steel into mortars, and entire cities into uninterrupted production lines. While Japan calculated each projectile, the Americans fired as if ammunition were an inexhaustible resource, because for them it was. This is the story of how the Pacific War was won, not by admirals or brilliant strategies, but by the mathematics of ammunition. How American logistical superiority destroyed a doctrine based on honor, accuracy, and rationing. And why, in the end, Japan was defeated not because of a lack of courage, but because of a lack of capsules. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story more than any explosion or battle. Between 1941 and 1945, Japan melted down 45,000 bells from Buddhist temples, some more than 1,000 years old, to try to make ammunition casings. In the same period, the United States rejected hundreds of thousands of projectiles in quality tests, simply because they were non-standard. While a Japanese cannon received 10 rounds per mission, a single American destroyer spent 15,000 on training alone. This isn't just a comparison of arsenals, it's a premonition of collapse. If you value stories like this, based on archives, engineering, and real memory, support this channel with your like and subscription. This allows us to continue bringing to light the numbers that really decided the war. By the time the first shots of the Pacific War rang out, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already carrying a combat manual shaped not just by doctrine, but by limitation. On their ships, each shot had to justify its existence. It wasn't just a matter of aim or strategy, it was a matter of logistical survival. The artillery manuals instructed, keep fire contained, fire only with a real chance of hitting, conserve ammunition until the critical moment. The Type 96 25mm Timmy, Japan's main light anti-aircraft weapon, had its rate of fire limited not by engineering, but by scarcity. The ideal of absolute precision has become a dogma. The training of the gunners reflected this. Short bursts, between 3 and 5 shots, cease immediately after exceeding the ideal range. Even in the face of diving bombardments, commanders hesitated. They knew that their storehouses could not support a sustained defense. On ships like the Ryujo and the Shokaku, the commanders knew only 12 minutes of continuous anti-aircraft fire was available before silence. It was necessary to choose when to fight. It was necessary to save even on fear. This doctrine of control was not just technical, it was cultural. It was based on decades of tactical refinement, where scarcity had been transformed into a virtue. The officers taught that superiority came from precision. To miss was worse than not to shoot. And above all, the doctrine assumed that all naval powers faced the same constraints. It was this assumption that turned a structural limitation into strategic blindness. During the first engagements in the Coral Sea and at Midway, Japanese accounts reveal a growing unease. American guns kept firing. In each engagement, it seemed that the enemy ships were ignoring all known rules about ammunition conservation. Commander Tishi Nato of the aircraft carrier Shokaku recorded that the American destroyers maintained anti-aircraft fire for more than 4 hours without interruption. It was as if they were carrying ammunition for a whole month, he wrote. That didn't make sense within the Japanese logic. The error, some thought, must be in the reports, but the mistake was in the initial assumption. While the Japanese taught their gunners to aim only at the ideal target, the Americans trained theirs to cover the sky. The American doctrine was based on volume and statistics. It was not necessary to hit a plane with a single shot. It was enough to make it impossible for him to cross the space between the ships. To this end, each anti-aircraft gun was part of a larger, synchronized, interconnected system, fed by deposits that seemed inexhaustible. The U.S. Navy did not struggle with economics. He fought abundantly. The training of the gunners reflected this mentality, to shoot to the limit of mechanical endurance. We covered exercises where each operator fired more ammunition in a single session than their Japanese counterparts had available in the entire war. In a 1942 after-action report, Captain Hara notes that American ships fired so many shells that the night sky lit up as if it were daytime. He wasn't exaggerating. During night engagements on Guadalcanal, cruisers such as the USS San Francisco and USS Helena fired as many as 1,500 5-inch shells in less than half an hour. Some Japanese officials assumed that they were facing new automatic weapons, such was the speed of the bursts. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. Americans could only afford to shoot. Their ships were supplied by a logistics chain that began in factories thousands of miles from the fighting, operated by tens of thousands of workers. It was the birth of the cruelest contrast of that war, the war of ammunition. On average, a Japanese destroyer began its missions with about 2,000 5-inch ammunition. In a single battle, they used up to 40% of this total. The Americans, on the other hand, knew that each spent projectile would be replaced, not in weeks, but in days. Production in Hastings, Nebraska alone would be enough to replenish the entire Pacific Fleet several times a month. And this is the factual moment that defines the asymmetry. The United States produced 47 billion light munitions during the war, while all of Japan produced only 15 million in all calibers, a ratio of more than 3,000 to 1. If this statistic surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. That was the truth hidden beneath every naval battle. Japan wasn't just fighting ships, it was fighting factories. The outcome of this divergent doctrine was inevitable. One side shot by reflex, the other afraid. Japanese shortages became a psychological burden. Gunners hesitated, commanders calculated, sailors prayed that the next attack would be brief. The Americans, by contrast, have adopted an aggressive philosophy. If there is doubt, shoot. If there is movement, shoot. If the radar picks up something, fire it. Ammunition was seen as an extension of national strength, not as a resource to be guarded. And when Japanese officials finally understood this reality, the doctrine of control collapsed. The next part of this story will show what happened when this doctrine met reality in its raw state. At sea, at night, under the incandescent light of 1,000 American cannons firing without pause. It will be the night when Captain Hara understood for the first time that his ship did not face a navy, it faced an industry. Guadalcanal, November 13, 1942. At 01:48, under the thick darkness of the South Pacific, the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze was sailing in tactical silence, attentive to the slightest sign of movement. Captain Tamechi Hara, a disciplined veteran and faithful to the doctrine of accuracy, was watching from the bridge when the beam of an American searchlight cut through the night like a white blade. In the following seconds, the doctrine evaporated. The artillery of the American cruiser USS San Francisco opened fire with an intensity that defied any known logic of Japanese naval warfare. In less than a minute, more than 1,200 5-inch shells were fired, more ammunition than Amatsukaze itself carried for the entire mission. It was as if the sky had erupted. The explosions lit up the waters like inverted lightning, and the air was filled with the low sound of cannons in uninterrupted succession. Hara later wrote that it was like entering the crater of a volcano made of steel and fire. Their gunners had no time to react, not because they were unprepared, but because they were run over by a reality that no doctrinal simulation had predicted. The Americans were willing to spend ammunition as if it were oxygen. The Japanese officers, trained to preserve every shot, hesitated. The Americans, by contrast, saturated the environment with a technical principle that would become devastating. Volume trumps precision. This was the first time that the crew of the Amatsukaze faced what the Americans would call a fire curtain. The curtain of fire. It was not a question of aiming, but of denying space. Not to attack a ship, but to turn every cubic meter of air around it into potential death. The shock was not just physical, it was doctrinaire. The entire mental structure of the Imperial Navy, forged in honor, calculation, and efficiency, collapsed when it encountered a force that, in practice, did not count its shots. During combat, Japanese anti-aircraft guns, limited in number and cadence, tried to respond with measured, accurate, almost elegant shots, but each American outburst seemed to mock that elegance. Inside the San Francisco, gunners took turns reloading shifts, feeding heated guns to incandescence. Some reports indicate that the tubes glowed red. The ammunition arrived in wakes from the ship's internal magazines, designed to sustain constant fire for hours, not minutes. The cruiser's tactical structure had been designed to maximize volume, not just power. While the Japanese ships were dealing with containment protocols, the Americans had embraced repeat engineering. Aboard the Amatsukaze, Captain Hara witnessed the impacts with an expression his subordinates described as petrified. He, one of the only Japanese officers who would survive the attack on Pearl Harbor until the final surrender, there, he understood, even if without words, that there was something greater than technique at play. The enemy was struggling with other mathematics. Tokyo's naval radio would interpret the battle as an isolated occurrence. But for the men who were there, it was the harbinger of a pattern. In later interrogations, Japanese officers reported feeling helpless in the face of American firepower, not because of the lethality of each shot, but because of its abundance. When a Japanese destroyer spent 800 shells in combat, it was a reason for reporting, calculation, rationing. In San Francisco, that same amount was fired up in a matter of minutes and then replenished in a matter of days. The difference was more than tactics. It was civilizational. For the first time, the doctrine of control found an enemy that did not play by the same rules. The Battle of Guadalcanal would become a watershed moment, not for the loss of ships, but for the loss of illusion. Japan realized that it faced not only a powerful navy, but a moving assembly line. Each American capsule launched into the sea was a reminder that the war would not be won by whoever calculated best, but by whoever could spend the most. And the true scale of that advantage was yet to come. Because while the Amatsukaze struggled to survive with its nearly empty depots, 7,000 kilometers away in the heart of the United States, an ammunition depot was already preparing the next shipment of 15,000 tons, enough to repeat Guadalcanal 50 times. What would happen when this logistics found not only destroyers, but the entire Japanese fleet on the open seas? That question would be answered with projectiles. And the next battle would make it clear that the volcano was still just beginning to roar. In Hastings, Nebraska, the chimneys did not rest. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, the sound of presses, rails, and engines created an industrial echo that could be heard for miles. But that was no ordinary factory. It was a living organism, powered by ore, energy, and technical precision, capable of producing 300,000 artillery shells per month. For each capsule, there was a structural integrity test, gauge check, visual inspection, and quality control with a mathematical standard. If they failed by millimeters, they were discarded. There was no room for error. Arsenals like Hastings and McAllister in Oklahoma were not just factories. They were factory cities, with hospitals, schools, restaurants, and their own railway system. Each employee had a defined role, measured productivity, and goals overseen by engineers who had migrated from the automotive industry. Detroit's know-how crossed the country, and the logic of the automobile assembly lines began to produce instruments of war with the same speed with which it used to produce sedans. The American artillery was mounted as if it were a Ford engine and tested with the rigor of an airplane. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japan struggled to keep the furnaces of its makeshift factories alight. Many operated without stable electricity, using burnt oil or low-purity coal. The shortage of copper forced the reuse of ammunition already fired. Children were employed as workers, especially after 1943, in factories such as Toyokawa. Training was minimal, and accidents were frequent. In some industrial complexes, the proportion of capsules approved for use was less than 60%. The precise explosives required by the Navy were increasingly rare. Improvised substitutes, less powerful and unstable, began to be used, increasing the failure rate. By 1944, it was estimated that nearly 30% of medium-caliber ammunition produced in Japan had detonation problems. The Japanese industrial war wasn't just minor, it was fragile. Its foundations trembled under the weight of a war that demanded the impossible. American superiority was not only in quantity, but in the cycle. In Hastings, the average time between the logistics order and delivery to the port was 9 days. To Japan, this same journey could take 6 weeks and was often interrupted by bombing or a lack of ships. The ability to refuel quickly meant that American ships fired with confidence, certain that fresh ammunition was already on the way. The doctrine of saturation was not just a tactic, it was a direct reflection of the machine that underpinned it. When an American destroyer released 15,000 rounds in a combat simulation, that number was just a statistic in the logistical reports. For Japan, it was equivalent to the consumption of an entire naval division for a month. The discrepancy did not go unnoticed by the Allies. British officers who visited American arsenals reported a degree of automation and speed never before observed in any army in the world. Colonel Ian Stoddart wrote, "America struggles with industries. We fight with armies." This observation, made with admiration and a certain resignation, captured the essence of what was happening in the Pacific. Japan still believed in the figure of the disciplined combatant, refined technique, honor in naval combat. But the United States had understood that modern wars are won by those who can repeat them. Repeat shots, repeat production, repeat deliveries. The victory was in the pattern, not in the individual gesture. To understand scale, a simple exercise is required. During the whole of 1944, Japan produced 120,000 shells of naval artillery. The United States, in the same period, produced 15 million. This difference was not a propagandistic exaggeration. It was counted, measured, packaged, and shipped by rail. It was war transformed into pure mathematics, and when there were failures, bent capsules, unstable alloys, delayed detonations, they were rejected. Hastings discarded more shells per month than all of Japan could manufacture, and each discarded capsule was immediately replaced by another, tested and approved. American efficiency was so great that some assembly lines were already producing above the target and storing surplus even before orders arrived. Warehouses in San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Brisbane were accumulating ammunition to levels that would cause panic in any Japanese command. But perhaps the most ironic element is this: the Imperial Japanese Navy knew these statistics. Through espionage, intercepts, and field reports, officials in Tokyo learned of American logistical superiority. They knew about the arsenals, the scale of production, the constant replenishment, and yet they maintained the doctrine of conservation, as if each capsule had spiritual value. They continued to train their gunners to shoot little, aim hard, and rely on accuracy as a decisive factor. The doctrine did not yield to reality. He gave in to destruction, and the price would be paid in battles where American ammunition would speak for itself. In Japan, Workers shed tears as they melted the bells of ancient temples to extract the copper needed for war. In the United States, the same metal arrived in freight cars, coming from mines in Arizona, refined in plants in Chicago, and delivered on time. One side sacrificed symbols of its history, the other transformed ore into ammunition with the coldness of a factory schedule. And while Japan prayed for capsules, America piled them up. But if the numbers still don't convince, what comes next will make it clear. On the battlefield, when the enemy flew low, the Japanese counted every shot, and the Americans just pulled the trigger until the sky darkened. Because in the next part, the war is no longer between ships, and it becomes between logics, one that awaits the perfect target, and another that prefers to flood the air with fire. In February 1943, in the Central Pacific Theater, the Japanese frigate Ishigaki found herself under attack by American B-25 bombers. In the open sea, his gunners waited in silence, with fingers on the triggers as enemy planes approached. They couldn't shoot. The manuals were clear. Fire was only to be opened when the enemy was within 800 yards. The order was not out of caution, it was out of necessity. Each burst consumed capsules that could not be easily replaced. The warehouses were low, and the Central Command required reports on every shell spent. The shots had to be justified. Around Ishigaki, the sky roared with engines, but its cannons remained mute until it was too late. The Japanese logic of efficiency was almost ritualistic. Do not waste, do not make mistakes, do not rush. But the war did not respect rituals. The war rewarded who shot first, who shot the most, who always shot. Meanwhile, on American destroyers like the USS Fletcher, the approach was diametrically opposed. All it took was one radar contact or a shadow in the sky for all the guns to open fire in unison. The goal was not to hit a specific point, but to turn all the space around the ship into a killing field. It was the doctrine of saturation in action, a curtain of projectiles so dense that to fly through it was to sign a sentence. American ships operated with ammunition buffers that allowed them to fire for hours, sustaining fire even when the target disappeared. Volume was the tactic. The mistake was part of the plan. If one shot didn't hit, another 50 would follow. Precision was not discarded but replaced by insistence. American gunners were not trained to wait. They were trained to act. The contrast between these two doctrines was not just technical, it was symbolic. On the one hand, the culture of patience, discipline, calculation. On the other, the culture of abundance, of immediate response, of trust in volume. A typical Japanese pilot on training missions was given 60 bullets per exercise. That's right, 60. Enough for 2 seconds of continuous fire. In real combat, the average was 120 to 160, with strict orders to conserve ammunition until the enemy was perfectly framed. The manuals reinforced, don't shoot until you're sure. Each capsule was a moral decision. An American F-6F Hellcat pilot went into combat with more than 2,400 rounds in the 650 cannons and was instructed to pour fire whenever the enemy appeared in the field of vision. There was no rationing of action. There was tactical freedom, and behind that there was certainty there would be more ammunition tomorrow. This difference shaped the combats even before the first shot. Japanese officers report their frustration at seeing enemy planes resist several attack passes without ceasing fire. It was as if his gunners never ran out of bullets, and in fact, they were not. The USS Bunker Hill, after a kamikaze attack, fired more than 4,500 shells in 17 minutes. Technical reports show that the ship was completely refueled in less than 48 hours. In contrast, the aircraft carrier Zuikaku had to abort operations in October 1944 due to a lack of anti-aircraft ammunition. Japan didn't just lose because of technological inferiority. It lost because it couldn't keep pace. Modern warfare was no longer decided by bravery, but by logistical chains. Interrogations conducted by the Americans after the war reveal the bewilderment of Japanese officers. Admiral Kusaka in 1946 confessed, "We did not understand how they could keep the fire going for so long. We thought it was a psychological trick. It wasn't. It was a railroad line that crossed Kansas. It was a factory in Hastings. It was a replacement system that functioned as a vital artery of an armed force that did not believe in economy during combat." And the irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Battles that seemed balanced on the maps became one-sided in the skies. Japanese doctrine, designed for a war of brief and decisive encounters, collided with a war of attrition and repetition. When every American pilot could miss 1,000 times and still return to the carrier with ammunition, there was no room for the refined style of the old Japanese naval school. It was like taking a sword to a hammer factory. Japan was looking for perfection. America was looking for continuity. And in the end, it was the side that could make mistakes at will that had the best chance of winning. But the real collapse was yet to come. Because while Japan struggled to keep its guns fueled, the United States was testing something new. A projectile that no longer needed to hit the target directly. It was enough to be around. In the next part, we'll look at how a seemingly modest technical breakthrough would forever change anti-aircraft warfare and make every American shot even more efficient, even when it missed. Between May 1942 and June 1944, the Pacific ceased to be a strategic chessboard and became a field of industrial experiments. With each confrontation, the numbers began to speak louder than the ships. In the Coral Sea, the first signs appeared in a subtle way. The Americans fired almost 3 times more anti-aircraft ammunition than expected in conventional doctrine. At Midway, the pattern was confirmed. Even with fewer ships, the U.S. fleet sustained a volume of fire that seemed disconnected from tactical logic. Japanese officials began to suspect that there was more than courage behind this behavior. There was infrastructure. In the Philippine Sea in June 1944, suspicion turned to panic. During the so-called Great Shot at Peru, as the American pilots dubbed it, more than 400 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day, most without even getting close to the targets. The number of shells fired by American ships in this operation exceeded 250,000, a number that alone exceeded the total monthly production of Japanese naval ammunition. But what made this figure even more devastating was not the quantity, it was the quality. At the center of this revolution was a device the size of an apple, the VT fuse or proximity fuse, developed in secret by the U.S. Navy's research laboratory and mass-produced with the help of Bell Telephone Laboratories and Western Electric. This small electronic component allowed projectiles to explode automatically when they were close enough to a target, without the need for direct impact. It was a silent change, almost invisible to the naked eye, but which transformed each shot into a radius threat. The margin of error, once the biggest obstacle for anti-aircraft artillery, had been eliminated with engineering. Conservative estimates suggest that with proximity fuses, the lethality of American anti-aircraft fire increased by as much as 600%. What used to require hundreds of shots to bring down a plane now requires a few dozen. And the ships that they had previously only defended, now exterminated. Operation Hailstone in February 1944 showed the world, and especially Japan, what happened when logistics, technology, and artillery merged into a single attack. For 2 days, American forces attacked the Japanese base at Truk, considered until then the Gibraltar of the Pacific. More than 200 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air or on the ground. The number of shells fired during the dogfights exceeded 380,000, a figure that was only possible because the refueling arsenals functioned as hydraulic systems, pumping ammunition incessantly from factories in the American interior to ships thousands of miles away. No American ships were sunk, and the projectiles that missed their targets were not wasted. They were just statistics absorbed by a system that didn't need to economize. On the Japanese side, the situation was different. Their artillery shells still used impact or time fuses, which were extremely sensitive and had high failure rates. In tests conducted by the Japanese themselves, only 62% of the 25mm capsules could detonate correctly in real combat conditions. Some reports from pilots show that their aircraft withstood multiple bursts without sustaining critical damage. In addition, the chemical composition of Japanese explosives became increasingly unstable due to the shortage of refined raw materials. To compensate, factories began to use low-quality substitutes which further reduced the detonation power. In other words, even when they got it right, the Japanese got it wrong. The introduction of the proximity fuse by the United States was not just an innovation. It was a turning point of eras. For the first time, American superiority was expressed not only in tons or frequency of refueling, but in the sophistication of what each capsule could do. The ammunition became intelligent, and when a system based on quantity also acquires quality, war is transformed. There was no longer a balanced confrontation. There was no more duel. There was only one industry playing against an ideology, and ideology was on fire. Commander Yoshio Shiga of Truk Air Force Base described American anti-aircraft fire during Operation Hailstone as an invisible wall that tore through the sky. Its pilots could not cross, not because of lack of skill, but because there was no free space. The sensors of the American fuses detected approaches in fractions of a second and detonated the projectiles with lethal precision. Japan had no answer, neither technique nor tactics. The only way out was to reduce the missions or resort to suicide. And that's what they did, because when the bullets don't work, the meat becomes ammunition. American technological superiority ushered in a new type of combat. One where every shot, however distant, was deadly. Each capsule carried not only explosives, but engineering, science and statistics. The Japanese were still calculating the ideal time to shoot. The Americans timed their shots to do this themselves. War now belonged to those who could automate death, but the true extent of this chasm had not yet been fully understood. Because, while the capsules flew intelligently on the other side of the ocean, millions of civilian workers, many of them women, fueled the machine with superhuman speed. In the next part, we will see how the factory replaced the arsenal, and how the heart of the war came to beat not on ships, but on the assembly lines of the United States. A production that did not stop neither at night nor on Sundays. Because, as one anonymous worker in Hastings put it, here every capsule carries the end of a dictatorship. The war allowed flashes of tactical genius, and Japan had them. On Savo Island in 1942, Japanese destroyers executed a night infiltration maneuver that sank 2 Allied light cruisers. The attack was swift, accurate, and in many circles was hailed as an example of the superiority of the Imperial Navy in night operations. But the same battle that brought technical prestige revealed a problem that Japan could never solve. By the end of the action, the Japanese ships, although intact, were practically unarmed. Commander Toshikazu Omi, in a report sent to the General Staff, summed it up coolly. "We withdrew because there was no ammunition left." The phrase, at first glance tactical, was actually strategic. It condensed the collapse of a doctrine built on an illusion that tactical efficiency by itself would sustain a war of attrition. But a navy that wins a battle and has to retreat for lack of capsules is not a fighting force. It is a performance with counted ammunition. And war is not impressed by performances. Demand continuity. In the following months, this pattern would be repeated. Japan demonstrated boldness, ingenuity, and discipline. In isolated actions, his ships were able to surprise larger forces, but always at the cost of one's own future. A single confrontation could consume an entire month's supply. The logic of absolute economy, which had shaped the training, now destroyed any chance of a sequel. Destroyers returned to ports with their guns intact, but with empty holds, and there was no ammunition waiting. In many cases, replacement depended on materials brought in from Manchuria or Korea, subject to delays, losses, and sabotage. The war of attrition became a war of attrition, and the exhaustion was Japanese. Meanwhile, Americans were learning. Each partial defeat was studied with a magnifying glass. Each tactical error was transformed into a logistical adjustment. What was lacking in tactical refinement, it made up for in adaptation, and more, there was surplus in supply. An American destroyer could fire 70% of its ammunition in combat and be refueled before sunrise. That meant I could fight every day, and the doctrine was adjusted accordingly. The U.S. Navy's planning began to operate on the concept of persistent saturation. It was not enough to win. It was necessary to maintain the ability to win again and again until there was no enemy left. This difference was not limited to the sea. In air operations, American pilots reported that, even after unsuccessful missions, they returned to the aircraft carriers and found ammunition ready. They could make mistakes, try again. The Japanese, on the contrary, knew that each mission could be the last, not only because of death, but because of the logistical emptying. The hangars were full, but the warehouses were empty. Maintenance officers improvised ammunition with repurposed parts. In Okinawa, a symbolic statistic was recorded. 40% of the anti-aircraft shells used in the first week had been remanufactured from capsules already fired and collected. Japan was literally beginning to recycle its artillery. It was a war between the new and the remade. The ideological collapse did not come with an explosion. It came with silence. The silence of the cannons that could no longer fire. The doctrine of economics, born of necessity, has become dogma. And like all dogma, it ignored reality. Men were trained to hit perfectly, but there was nothing left to shoot with. By 1945, the average ammunition available per mission in frontline units had fallen to less than 25% of what was predicted in the 1939 manuals. The manuals themselves began to be revised, not for technical advancement, but for moral retreat. The ideal could no longer be demanded. It was necessary to survive with the minimum. And it was in this context that Omi's phrase gained another meaning. We withdrew because there was no ammunition left. It was not just a report. It was an epitaph. The Imperial Navy had not lost the will to fight. He had lost the right to continue. Because his logic demanded the impossible, to win with less, always. But less was no longer enough. The fuel dried up. The tanks emptied. And the enemy, who missed more, fired more, flew more, now began to hit with overwhelming frequency. In interrogations conducted after the war, several Japanese officers admitted that they did not know how to refuel at a pace compatible with the American war. The problem wasn't transportation, it was production. There were no capsules. And when there were no explosives, and when there were explosives, there was a lack of copper. It was a sequence of scarcity, a logic of failure. The doctrine that once taught to conserve, now only taught to postpone, and the enemy did not expect it. In the next part, the story leaves the battlefield and enters the production spreadsheets. We will see how each capsule fired by an American ship represented not only fire, but the synchronized operation of thousands of factories, mines, trains, and hands. Because the American victory did not begin at sea, it started on the factory floor, and it was there, between the noise of the presses and the heat of the ovens, that the Japanese lost the war before they even heard the first shot. In 1943, While the United States consumed more than 450,000 tons of copper a year, enough to cover every building in a modern metropolis, Japan struggled to extract 80,000 tons, and that for all its national needs: energy, communication, industry, and armaments. The mathematics of war, hitherto invisible to the public eye, was beginning to reveal itself in the choices that nations made in silence. In the United States, copper was an abundant resource, coming in continuous trains from Arizona and refined in industrial giants of Ohio and Pennsylvania. In Japan, every gram was a contest. The shortage has reached such a point that authorities have ordered the removal of public door handles, bells from Buddhist temples, and even centuries-old statues. More than 45,000 temples literally contributed their sacred bells so that the Navy could fire. But even with this symbolic sacrifice, stocks did not meet demand. For each capsule manufactured, a story was melted. Each shot cost not only gunpowder, but memory. The logistical cost of war wasn't just in tons, it was in decisions. An American 127mm projectile manufactured at Hastings cost an average of $4.20. The same caliber in Japan went for more than $17 if we consider the energy cost, the scarcity of raw materials, and the fragility of internal transport. The impact of this was devastating. While the United States could test, miss, discard, and repeat, Japan could only shoot when it was sure. Not out of doctrine, but out of desperation. The economy imposed by scarcity was transformed into dogma, and dogma in tactical backwardness. This chasm was also invisible to Japan's European enemy, Germany. In 1942, the German High Command underestimated the American industrial machine, believing that democracy could not coordinate a large-scale war. The reports sent to the Wehrmacht were categorical. American production was numerous but inaccurate, abundant but slow, full of waste, a fatal reading error. In just 1 year, the United States built more capsules than Germany did in the entire war. Let us repeat, more ammunition in 12 months than the Reich in 6 years. A statistic like this changes the weight of the narratives. If this surprises you, comment now. Logistics wins. This logistical victory came not only from production, but from philosophy. The Americans planned the war as a stream. The copper extracted from the ground was refined, transformed into capsules, tested, packaged, shipped, distributed, and fired in less than 30 days. This cycle, which seemed unrealistic to the Japanese, was sustained by railroads, stable electricity, and a concept that few armies understood: serial warfare. The Japanese still operated under the artisanal logic. Every piece counted, every shot was thought out. Americans operated under industrial logic. Every piece was one among thousands, every mistake a lesson, every shot a statistic. The conflict then ceased to be between armies. It became a confrontation between two philosophies. One that believed that war was an art of precision, another that treated it as a repetition algorithm. And in this confrontation, it was not enough to have courage. It was necessary to have copper, and the United States did. The abundance of resources gave doctrinal freedom. Scarcity in Japan imposed moral limitations. Japanese officers report in personal diaries the emotional weight of each capsule fired, not for fear of missing, but for what that capsule represented: a sacred statue, a family heritage, a memory that would not return. This is the point at which war becomes existential, when each shot carries not only metal, but meaning. When the price of maintaining the front line is the silent disappearance of an ancient culture. Japan was trying to sustain a modern war with the soul of an ancient civilization, and it was paying that price with its own history. In Hiroshima, a temple was emptied of its sacred objects to reforge 25mm shells. None of them returned. But while Japan lost its soul to keep the war body standing, the Americans moved the body like an impersonal, unstoppable machine. Each capsule fired by a destroyer was the result of a production chain that began on the rails, passed through foundries, inspection lines and ballistic tests, and ended up in the hands of a sailor who did not even know where that projectile had come from. Impersonality was the weapon, because if war needed thousands of decisions a day, only an industrialized civilization could make them. And the Germans, observing this from afar, began to realize the error. In 1943, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, confessed to Hitler that it was no longer possible to compete with American industry. They build as if they had infinite time, and we, as if each capsule were our last. The phrase, not said in combat, but in the office, carried the harbinger of defeat, because a war won in the role of production cannot be reversed in the field. Japan was still fighting, but its doctrine, its culture and its capacity had already been surpassed even before its capsules left the factory floor. In the next part, we will see how this logic of American mass production evolves into something even more audacious, the absolute standardization of war. It was not enough to produce a lot, it was necessary to produce the same, and in doing so the United States would create the most lethal weapon of the 20th century. Not a bomb, but a concept. A system where every part, from every ship, in any ocean, spoke the same industrial language. And with that, they made each capsule part of a single global weapon. In September 1944, Kanoya Air Base in southern Japan received a shipment of 7.7mm capsules intended for training new pilots. The total number, 1,500 units. Divided among the cadets present, each received just over 30 shots. This was not a logistical error. It was the reflection of a reality that had reached the point of collapse. That same month, the USS New Jersey, cruising the Pacific, conducted an anti-aircraft gunnery exercise with the 5th Squadron. 48,127-meter shells were fired in one morning. No combat, training only. The difference was not just in volume, it was logical. While Japan prepared to face death with 30 bullets per pilot, the United States trained as if the steel had no end, and in fact, it didn't. The war had ceased to be symmetrical. It was no longer a dispute between tactics. It was a verdict where the verdict was printed on production lines. On the island fronts, the reality was even more stark. Japanese gunners, positioned to defend strategic airfields, were given fixed quotas of fire. On Okinawa, an intercepted report detailed orders that 25mm anti-aircraft guns should only be used against multiple targets and within 600 meters. It was an artillery that needed to save until the chance to hit. The concept of a curtain of fire was non-existent. There were no longer resources to wait for a new load. It was necessary to decide, with each plane sighted, whether it was worth shooting, and most of the time, the order was to wait. Wait for the right target. Wait for the right moment. Wait for the right capsule. A wait that cost lives and time. Time that Japan no longer had. The shortage of ammunition did not only affect the technical field, it invaded the moral field. At various bases, soldiers began training with wooden bayonets, others with unloaded rifles. Medical reports show an increase in fractures because of forced simulations with improvised weaponry. The war was not only being lost at sea, it was being eroded from the inside. On the psychological front, officers began to register a subtle but profound change in troop behavior. They no longer trained to win, one trained to die effectively. And it was in this void that the definitive idea of absolute scarcity was born. The kamikaze. In the absence of capsules, the man became ammunition. The kamikaze doctrine was not just a strategic response, it was a cry of logistical desperation. If artillery could no longer stop American ships, then the planes themselves would be the capsules, each pilot a projectile, each engine a detonator. Efficiency, previously sought in technical precision, has come to be measured by the willingness to sacrifice. Japan began training young people to transform themselves into human warheads. Many took off without weapons, just enough fuel to get to the target. The capsule was the body, the impact, the purpose. The doctrine of honor hid the statistic of despair. It was cheaper to lose a man than to make a bomb. And as these young men took to the skies on sure-death missions, American ships kept firing. In a single morning, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the USS White Plains and her escorts spent more than 60,000 capsules trying to counter suicide attacks. Most of the shots hit nothing, but that didn't matter. There were more capsules. There was always more. It was a war in which error was allowed as long as it came in large quantities. And that was the American advantage, to make mistakes until you get it right. Hit until the sky is empty, empty the sky until there was nothing left to fall into. Japan could not sustain this pace, not for lack of courage, but for not being able to produce anymore. What remained was to transform the little that was available into a symbol. The missing capsule was replaced by speeches. The bomb is absent by prayers. The absence of projectiles, improvised steel, and recycled gasoline. A nation that once prized naval perfection now staked everything on voluntary death. And that was not a strategy. It was bankruptcy. Every kamikaze thrown was a confession. We can no longer maintain a modern war. The accounts of the surviving officers coldly describe this new reality. In April 1945, Lieutenant Masafumi Arima, after inspecting Kyushu's coastal defense line, recorded, "We have men, we have planes, but we don't have capsules anymore." Japan had reached the point where war became a ritual of sacrifice. Ammunition was no longer an arsenal item. It was a line in the budget of a collapsing civilization. In the next part, we will cross the Pacific again and enter the shipyards where war was decided not by generals, but by riveters, engineers, and women with wrenches. Because while Japan turned men into ammunition, the United States did the opposite. It turned machines into legions. And each capsule fired wasn't just a shot, it was a manifesto of modern industry. In 1943, the sky over the Pacific began to be redrawn by statistics, not acrobatics. The Japanese pilot who took off hoping to meet the enemy in single combat discovered too late that there would be no duel, there would be density. The American doctrine had abandoned the romanticism of aiming and hunting. In its place, it established the concept of air saturation. The F-6F Hellcat, the U.S. Navy's main fighter, was not a maneuverability prodigy nor an elegant machine, but it carried more than 2,050 shells per mission and had the structure to withstand unthinkable damage. Each patrol mission was treated as if it were the last, not because of the threat of the enemy, but because of the commitment to eliminate anything that moved. The orders were clear: shoot first, shoot hard, and don't wait for confirmation. Reports showed missions with 12 aircraft firing more than 30,000 rounds in less than 20 minutes. The logic was not to slaughter, it was to deny. Deny space, deny time, deny the possibility of survival. The Japanese doctrine, formed by pilots trained in the elegance of accurate firing, could not understand that. The Japanese instructor taught, "You have 3 seconds to aim, make them count." The American learned, "You have 3,000 shots, spread them out like rain." The difference was moral, doctrinal, and above all, mathematical. The sky, once considered the domain of the gods, came to be treated as a technical field, a space where human error would be corrected by mass repetition. If one projectile failed, 100 others would succeed it. If a pilot missed, 3 squadrons came behind to get it right. And if the enemy survived the first attack, there was hardly enough clear skies to escape the second. This transformation was evident in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19, 1944, more than 300 Japanese planes took off with the aim of attacking the American fleet. By the end of the day, 2/3 had been slaughtered, and most of them not by direct aerial combat, but by flak. the anti-aircraft fire fired from the dozens of ships that made up the fleet. There were more than 476,000 projectiles fired in a single day. A Japanese pilot who survived reported, "The sky was vibrating. It was like flying into a storm of invisible hammers." He was not shot down, but he never flew again. The experience had broken his soul, because contrary to what he expected, he did not encounter the enemy. He found a machine. The evolution of this logic meant that the sky was no longer a disputed space. It became property. Each zone over an American task group was protected by layers of artillery, as if they were concentric circles of death. The escort ships, anti-aircraft cruisers and aircraft carriers worked in coordination, firing with millimeter timing. Instead of aiming at planes, the cannons aimed at approach zones. It was like planting invisible mines in the air. If the enemy pilot flew there, he would be hit, not because he was detected, but because he entered the pattern. The Americans had turned the sky into armed territory. Each capsule fired had a cost, but this cost was absorbed by logistics that allowed for planned waste. The idea that shooting without seeing the target was ineffective was replaced by another, shooting until no one else wanted to fly. The psychology of the enemy became the real target, and it worked. In just 3 months, between June and September 1944, kamikaze missions began to emerge as a desperate response to the lethality of the new American sky. It was the implicit recognition that the air no longer belonged to the pilots. It belonged to the cannons. On the American side, the result was confidence. The pilots knew that even if they missed, the fleet would fire for them, and if they were hit, the ships were ready to cover their retreat. It was a network war. Each piece covered the flaw of the other. It was the absolute negation of Japanese individualism. War was no longer made of heroes, it was made of systems, of calculations, rate of fire, and of the doctrine of repetition. Japan watched this transformation with a mixture of astonishment and impotence. The attempt to maintain combat on the basis of honor and precision became increasingly untenable. Even the most veteran pilots began to question the logic of sacrifice in the face of a force that did not need to aim. A Japanese officer, interrogated after the war, summed it up. "We didn't fight men. We were fighting production." The phrase reveals the essence of this part of the story. Heaven, once sacred, has been secularized, and whoever controlled the factories controlled the firmament. In the next part, we will descend again to the ground, not to the battlefields, but to the corridors of American factories. We will see how women, migrants, and ordinary workers have transformed the concept of war, producing capsules as if packing bread. And how, in the greatest irony of history, it was the trivialization of ammunition that determined the end of a war made of sacrifice, because in the end, it wasn't the best driver who won. He was the one who had the most to waste. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the island of Samar, one of the most unlikely episodes in modern naval history would take shape. The USS Johnston, a destroyer weighing only 2,100 tons, launched itself against a Japanese force that included heavy cruisers and the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with more than 70,000 tons. It would be the equivalent of a slingshot facing a wall, but there was one detail that the war manuals did not foresee: ammunition. The Johnston, despite its modest size, carried more than 10,127mm shells, as well as torpedoes and a 50 artillery that could fire for hours. Their commander, Ernest Evans, knew he couldn't win by force, but he could win by persistence, and he insisted. For more than an hour, the small American ship hammered the Japanese line with a hellish cadence. It fired incessantly, reloaded as it maneuvered, used each cartridge as if it were the first. On the other side, the Yamato, designed to duel with equivalent rivals, fired its gigantic shells, each weighing almost a ton. But slowly. The giant's main weapons had a cooldown of over a minute, and each shot, no matter how devastating, accounted for a significant percentage of its total ammunition. The Yamato was made to destroy something big, but on that day there were only small, fast, and insistent targets. The irony was almost cruel. The largest ship in history, pride of imperial engineering, could not hit an enemy that spat projectiles in all directions. With each attempt to aim, Johnston was already in another position. With each shot from the Yamato, the Americans responded with 50. The logic of greatness succumbed to the logic of cadence. It was the collapse of the myth of heavy superiority. Torpedoes launched by Samuel B. Roberts, another escort destroyer, hit Japanese cruisers with enough force to force them to retreat. The American ship, known as the Destroyer, that fought like a battleship, had been hastily built with cheap, sparsely armored steel. But he took what mattered: ammunition. It shot to exhaustion, reloaded mid-battle, and resumed firing. The captain reported that the ship was shaking as if it was screaming. It was the power of repetition. The Battle of Samar was not won by armor. It was won by Davis versus Goliath logic, but with one difference. Davis had infinite stones. The American gunners, trained to fire at a continuous cadence, did not expect the perfect aim. They saturated the air, created panic, confused optical systems, forced evasive maneuvers. They didn't have to destroy, just interrupt. The Japanese, with limited ammunition and a doctrine of preservation, hesitated. Every shot from the Yamato was evaluated, every maneuver, measure. Meanwhile, American chaos was productive. Speed beat weight. This confrontation exposed the bankruptcy of the Japanese shipbuilding doctrine. The investment in a few giant, heavily armored ships made sense in a war of classic naval encounters. But real warfare was dynamic, chaotic, and required quantity more than perfection. And quantity was what the Americans had in excess. A single American escort ship could carry more capsules than an entire Japanese squadron. And more importantly, he wore them all. No fear, no rationing, no hesitation. The lessons of this battle echoed among the Japanese and German officers. In subsequent interrogations, commanders admitted that they underestimated the value of cadence. The belief that technical quality surpassed quantity was definitively destroyed. A German officer, in analyzing the data from the Battle of Samar, declared, "If we had the ammunition they throw away, maybe the war would be different." The sentence, almost bitter, reveals the essence of this confrontation. It wasn't just a dispute between ships, it was a dispute between worlds. A world that counted shots, and another that produced them as if they were sand. The Yamato would survive that day, but without glory. It was withdrawn not for critical damage, but for ineffectiveness. His shots, accurate, powerful, and limited, failed to defeat ships that would not stop firing. The Johnston, on the other hand, severely damaged, would sink, but its action would prevent the destruction of an entire American shipping fleet. The victory that day did not belong to those who resisted the most. He was one who could waste without fear. Of those who turned capsules into arguments. Of those who understood that modern war is not won by the strongest, but by the most tireless. In the next part, we will explore the heart of this logic, the concept of American serial warfare. We will see how, far from the front, men and women operating machines in uninterrupted shifts fed this cycle of endless firing, and how, in the end, each capsule launched at Samar began much earlier, at the push of a button in Detroit, on a brass press in Pittsburgh, or on a conveyor belt relay in Buffalo. Because the ammunition didn't fall from the sky, it came from the land. And there, the Americans had won even before the first shot. On the deck of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku in October 1944, silence was not strategic, it was enforced. The anti-aircraft batteries, positioned along the hull like teeth ready to bite the sky, were operational. The scorers in their positions, eyes fixed on the horizon. The enemy was approaching, but the triggers remained untouched. The doctrine was clear: don't waste ammunition until the right time. Each 25mm gun had an endowment of 10 to 15 rounds, 10, against entire formations of planes diving like blades. The commander in charge of the artillery gave the order, wait for the signal, and then the heavens opened in flames. Bursts of 50, rockets, bombs. All hell broke loose in seconds. Many of the gunners died without firing. Courage died. No, the opportunity is dead, because Japan, at that time of the war, did not fight with ammunition. It fought with hope. Reports found in the wreckage of the Zuikaku record that in its last hours, less than 20% of the anti-aircraft artillery was activated. Most of the cannons were destroyed, with their shells still intact. Men trained for precision, trained in years of discipline, died waiting for the ideal target. But the enemy did not operate for ideals. It operated by saturation. He shot before, during, and after. He shot where there was shadow, where there could be shadow, where there was nothing left. And that was what won. Japan still maintained its faith in tactical efficiency, but war was no longer tactical. It was logistics. A single American ship could fire 20,000 rounds a day. Japan, in the same period, was barely producing this in a week for the entire fleet. A direct comparison exposes the brutality of the abyss. While the United States consumed more than 1 million rounds a day in naval and air operations, the Japan-Germany axis was able to deliver together less than 100,000 medium-caliber capsules in the same interval, a difference of 10 times. If this statistic surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. And logistics didn't win only with quantity. He won with presence. Each American capsule rejected in tests was immediately replaced. Japan, on the other hand, without full access to copper and quality gunpowder, accepted badly fused, unstable capsules with fragile fuses. The shot he was supposed to protect became an uncertainty. Many reports point to cannons jamming on the first shot, gunners who reloaded under fire only to find that the capsule had exploded ahead of time, or worse, that it would never explode. This reality corroded doctrine. Commanders began to adapt orders. Rational use was transformed into ritual use. A commander at the Iwo Jima base recorded, "Only shoot if death is imminent, or if the soul is already lost." It was the recognition that combat had become existential. The enemy had fire to burn, even the mistakes. Japan does not. Each mistake was definitive, each decision irreversible. On land, the situation was no different. Gunners in bunkers waited for eye contact to fire. The capsules were counted and signed. Each unit was taken from stocks with handwritten receipts. The bureaucracy crossed to the front. On Okinawa, documents show that machine guns were kept silent during raids because supervisors had not authorized the release of the second magazine. The fear was not of death, it was a scarcity era, of absence, out of nowhere that would come after the first shot. Meanwhile, American ships sailed as mobile ammunition powerhouses. Each unit received almost daily replenishment. C-47 planes, reconverted for transport, carried capsules by the hundreds of thousands to makeshift bases on newly conquered islands. Where Japan sent fishing boats with rationed provisions, the US set up warehouses with forklifts and timed logistics systems. The ammunition was not just plenty, it was routine, it was guaranteed. This discrepancy created a new type of combat, the psychological. The Japanese soldiers began to realize that their enemy did not hesitate. I didn't save, I didn't expect it, and that broke the moral spine. Because where the Japanese trained for years to shoot perfectly, the American trained for weeks to shoot non-stop. And where one waited for the only chance, the other created 100 chances per minute. War, then, was no longer a matter of bravery. It was a repetition equation. The Japanese gunners, made to duel in ideal conditions, were thrown into a storm that ignored any code of honor. Many died with their finger on the trigger, not because they hesitated, but because they were not allowed to make mistakes. And those who cannot make mistakes have already lost. In the next part, we'll dive into the genesis of this American advantage. We'll see how, on the other side of the world, assembly lines with 24-hour shifts, operated by women and ordinary civilians, fueled this endless cycle of capsules, and how every shell fired in the Pacific began with a riveter in Michigan, with a workman in Nebraska, with a gear turning silently, but with the precision of a clock that never stopped. Because in the end, the real battlefield was not the sea. It was the factory. In early 1943, a small American capsule began to alter the curve of the war. It was no bigger than a thermos, but it carried inside it something that no army had used on a scale until then, an electronic brain. It was the VT fuse, the proximity fuse. Unlike traditional fuses, which exploded by contact, time, or direct impact, this one projected radio waves around itself and detonated as soon as it detected an object flying nearby. In other words, he didn't have to hit the target. It was enough to get close. American artillery, once limited by human aiming and manual calculations, was now gaining eyeballs, and ears, and reflexes. What once required perfect shooting has become just a matter of saturating the right area. The projectile took care of the rest. In the skies of the Pacific, this technology has redefined air combat. A Japanese fighter, maneuvering at 600 km/h, could evade tracer bullets, optical sights, ballistic predictions. But he did not escape the VT fuse. 15 meters away, the warhead exploded. The shrapnel tore through the fuselage with clockwork precision. In engagements such as those of Operation Hailstone in February 1944, the numbers made it clear. The rate of kills per shot increased by as much as 600%. In Okinawa, 57% of the downed kamikaze planes were not directly hit, they were destroyed by proximity. Japan watched, helpless. Their detonation system still depended on mechanical fuses, manual timing, calibration made with rulers and markers. In many cases, the shells exploded ahead of time, or later, or never. The war, which was once fought with the iron finger, now relied on semiconductors, microtubes, and electromagnetic oscillations. And the US had invested heavily in this. More than 22 million proximity fuses were produced between 1942 and 1945. The production was so vital that the show was kept under absolute secrecy, rated as more sensitive until the Manhattan Project. In contrast, Japan did not even have the industrial capacity to smelt the necessary copper at scale. Most of its anti-aircraft ammunition continued to operate with World War I-based systems. Even when they knew they were at a technological disadvantage, they couldn't keep up. There was a lack of materials, machines, and above all, time. An Imperial Navy report even stated, "We would need 48 months and access to Allied-controlled ores to start our own proximity fuse production line. The war would not grant even half of that." The real strength of this technology wasn't just in the shooting, it was in the consequence. With fewer capsules, the Americans made more. A ship equipped with VT fuses could shoot down 3, 4, even 5 planes with the same number of shots that before could barely damage one. That meant less recharging, less exposure, more response time. It meant efficiency without rationing. The air became an electrified space. Anything that entered without permission was detected and punished. There was no longer fair combat. There was anticipation. There was a reading of the trajectory. There was intelligence in the steel itself. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese pilots began to report that the sky exploded without warning. Many did not understand how they were being slaughtered before they were seen. The doctrines of evasion, based on speed and angle, became useless. There was no point in diving, maneuvering, or flying low. The shell already knew where they would be, and he waited. This transition from human to sensory warfare has put the US in an unprecedented position. They no longer needed perfect marksmen. They just needed operators who pointed in the right direction. The rest was done by circuits. The learning curve has disappeared. An 18-year-old recruit could operate a cannon with efficiency comparable to that of a veteran, because the projectile's brain corrected his hand. The margin of error no longer matters. In the German camp, the analyses were of incredulity. Luftwaffe officers questioned after the war stated that American artillery seemed to predict our movements. An engineer from the Kriegsmarine summed it up. They don't get it right because they're good. They get it right because they don't have to be. Germany, with all its tradition of precision engineering, had been overtaken by the industrialization of intelligence, and this realization was not only painful, it was final. Meanwhile, factories such as Crosley Corporation, Eastman Kodak, and General Electric were producing hundreds of thousands of fuses a month. The assembly lines were operated by women, many without technical training, trained only to repeat the procedures exactly. A soldering error, a seal failure, and the fuse would not work. But the system was so well designed that it allowed for redundancy, testing, and immediate disposal. The failure rate was less than 3%. For an artifact that operated at the edge of physics, this was virtually perfect. In practice, what was created was an artillery with instinct, and against that there was no honor, there was no strategy, there was no tradition that resisted. Japan, which had built its ships with philosophy and its pilots with idealism, now faced capsules that thought faster than any commander. It was the end of the war as an arena of heroes. The era of autonomous, albeit rudimentary weaponry began. In the next part, we'll look at how this electronic innovation shaped not only the outcomes of war, but also the future of war itself. We will reveal how the United States, after mastering the artillery of the present, began to design what would come next. Magnetically guided warheads, sensor bombs, and guided munitions that would take the first step toward armed intelligence. Because winning the war was not the end. It was the beginning of a new paradigm, where even projectiles had memory. In December 1944, the Japanese General Staff published an internal report that did not reach the public, nor the soldiers in the trenches. But it said it all. Only 15% of the ammunition needed to sustain defensive operations was available. It was no longer a question of scarcity. It was a sentence. For every 10 capsules that a commander requested, he only received 1.5. In certain regions, such as Luzon and the Ryukyu Islands, this number dropped to 10%, or less. Japan still had men, it still had trenches, it still had honor, but he no longer had projectiles, and without them, no doctrine could stand. Logistics had won over ideology, and calculation began to replace command. American military planners knew. Radio intercepts, field reports, and interrogations of prisoners pointed to an unstoppable trend. The enemy was dry. And it was at that moment that mathematics became a weapon. The U.S. Army began to devise attacks with logistical and psychological objectives, not just territorial ones. Bombing raids were organized not to destroy bases, but to force Japan to respond. Any shot they fired was ammunition that could not be used the next day. American fighters performed low flights with visual decoys. The ships simulated naval bombardments with no defined targets. It was a war of exhaustion for arithmetic. On the front, the impact was devastating. Japanese officers were given contradictory orders: resist at any cost, but without enough ammunition to resist. Entire troops were instructed to save shots up to the point of physical contact. The gunners had no more ammunition in reserve. The grenades were counted one by one. Marines carried cartridges wrapped in rice paper to prevent waste due to oxidation. On Okinawa, a battalion of 300 men received 200 rounds for a week of combat, 4 per head. The commanders knew the time of the fight was counted by shots. When they were over, the resistance would end, or suicide would begin. Lieutenant Shoji Inaba, in charge of coastal artillery on Iwo Jima, wrote in his diary, "My batteries are complete in number, but huts are empty inside. On the day of the American attack, its guns fired only once, not by tactics, by exhaustion. The Americans knew this. They even calculated how much the enemy could shoot before being silent. And when the sound ceased, they advanced. The U.S. occupation forces, after the war, found empty ammunition depots, abandoned defensive positions with handwritten manual reloading instructions. There were candies made with recycled metal from household items. Brass remains cast from civilian statues. There were reused capsules with only part of the explosive. Improvisation reached the pathetic. Infantrymen were ordered to capture enemy ammunition in combat. It was the only viable source. The war had become self-devouring, and in the face of this, the definitive tactic of desperation was born: the suicide attack. It was not just an expression of fanaticism, it was a calculation. If Japan didn't have enough capsules to launch, then it would launch the men themselves. The body began to replace the projectile. The cabin of an airplane became the capsule, the heart of the pilot, the detonator, and the target. Anything that might force the Americans to back down. It was a last effort, not for victory, but for posterity, so that history would know that they tried even without gunpowder. But the math remained ruthless. The United States knew that each kamikaze cost Japan a plane and a life, and they knew they could absorb it. They had reservations, they had substitutes, they had capsules. The American artillery in this same period operated with excess. Units landing in the Pacific received 150% of what was needed. As a margin of error, each battalion had redundant supplies. Each fleet had resupply lines that operated as conveyor belts. Factories in Kansas produced more ammunition in 1 month than all of Japan in 3. And each capsule, standardized, tested, packaged. The war became a serial production. Japanese resistance turned into manual scarcity. Military historian Raymond Taylor wrote, "It was the first time that the arming of one side became an argument. The United States no longer fought Japan. They fought their ability to resist scarcity, and this shortage was not just of capsules, it was time, of space, of response. It was a total shortage. The war at that stage was no longer commanded by generals. It was decided by spreadsheets. When the Americans landed on Luzon, the Japanese had warehouses with enough ammunition for only 3 days of combat. They resisted for almost 2 months, not by force, by faith, by repeating strategies with fewer resources every day, and for knowing that, after them, no one else would have anything. It was the logistical collapse disguised as heroism, the end of the line that still tried to look curved. In the next part, we will reveal how the United States was already anticipating the post-war period as it struggled, how abundance allowed planning not only to win, but to rebuild, and how, while Japan burned millennia-old bells to fuse capsules, the enemy built mobile universities, floating naval factories, and transportation systems that operated under any weather. Because those who win the war are not only those who shoot the most, they are the ones who are already preparing for what comes after the last shot. By August 1945, the Toyokawa arsenal was no longer a factory. It was a scream. Surrounded by hills and camouflaged by artificial forests, the complex housed almost 20,000 workers, half of them teenagers, many under the age of 13. It produced ammunition, light artillery shells, fuses and components for machine guns. There was no more pure copper. What was left was recycled from locks, coins, even pot handles. It was the last effort of a nation that turned everything into ammunition. But that summer, the war wanted no more capsules. I wanted silence. And the B-29s knew where to find it. On the 7th, more than 100 bombers departed Tinian with a single goal: to erase Toyokawa, not only halting production, but eradicating the possibility of reconstruction. There was no possible shielding. The bombs set fire to the warehouses, collapsed roofs on workers, incinerated nitrate deposits that exploded like volcanoes. The smoke rose for miles, and with it, Japan's last logistical hope rose. It was not a military base. It was the womb of Japanese ammunition. When the ground shook, not just one factory fell, the future of any Japanese capsule fell. The scales melted, the matrices are gone, and the records, handwritten, burned like scrolls of a collapsing empire. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them from the beginning: scale, standardization, automation. But Japan had bet on pride, sacrifice, and precision. The US bet on method, volume, and tolerance for error. While Japanese workers smelted aluminum in makeshift pots, Americans operated refrigerated factories with vibration sensors and preventive maintenance. A Japanese projectile took days to complete. An American shell was completed every 4.8 seconds on production lines, such as the one in Radford, Virginia. Japan didn't just need to win battles, it needed to survive its own inability to replicate the war effort. And he did not survive. The factories that remained operated with fragments of systems, without manuals, without replacement tools. The engineers had been summoned to the front. Experienced technicians have died in previous bombardments. What was left were students, peasants, the elderly, people trained in a hurry for tasks that required millimeter precision. One mistake, and the entire batch was discarded or explode. Records show that between January and July 1945, the failure rate in Japanese capsules exceeded 28%. 1 in 4 shots was harmless or self-destructive, and yet each capsule cost sacrifice, sweat, hunger. It was the symbol of a war that no longer knew how to fight, only how to persist. On the other side of the ocean, the US was already designing mobile factories, ship-based workshops that produced parts during transport. Entire trains functioned as moving assembly units. The Guam base alone had more ammunition stockpiled than the entire stockpile of Imperial Japan. The war had ceased to be a dispute over territory and had become a competition of permanence, and Japan disappeared even before surrendering. In Nagoya, another industrial center, the B-29s pulverized the light arm complexes. They were not looking for soldiers. They were looking for hydraulic presses, extrusion motors, tempering furnaces. What was being destroyed was not just production. It was the ability to have production. It was the future of resistance. Japan became incapable of manufacturing its own defeat. Each less capsule represented not only a war loss, but a cultural loss. War burned technology, but also time, and Japan could no longer manufacture either one. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts, based on documents, statistics, and real contrasts, show your support. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. This allows us to continue reconstructing, capsule by capsule, the technical memory that shaped the course of the war. In post-war interviews, one Japanese engineer confessed, "There came a time when we didn't know why we were producing anymore. Everything that came out of the factories was destroyed on the same day. It was no longer a strategy, it was repetition." Japan was experiencing an industrial effort that fueled its own extinction. Every day less was produced, every hour more was lost, until the war was no longer decided by generals, but by sound, or by the absence of it. The silence of the factories spoke louder than the gunshots. In the next part, we will reveal how, even in the face of absolute collapse, the United States has not slowed down. On the contrary, the plan was clear: to win without depending on chance, to show that even if Japan resisted for more months, the American response was already ready, in boxes, ships, warehouses. The war was decided, and yet The factories did not stop, because the real triumph was not winning. It was to show that, if they wanted to, they could do it again, as many times as necessary. In September 1945, when the guns finally fell silent in the Pacific, what was left of the Japanese naval leadership was looking for neither tactical justifications nor forgotten heroes. He was looking for technical explanations. Soemu Toyoda, former Chief of Staff of the Imperial Navy, was blunt in his assessment. "We don't fight men. We fight against factories." No metaphor was so accurate. For Toyoda and so many other officers, the defeat did not take place at sea, but on the industrial conveyor belts that never stopped producing. The war they imagined fighting, between ships, strategies and bravery, turned out to be another. A war won even before the first shot was fired, by an enemy that didn't have to be perfect. It was enough that he never stopped. Captain Tamechi Hara, who survived 14 naval engagements and led the Amatsukaze, did not hide his astonishment when questioned by the Americans. "You made a lot of mistakes," he said, "but they had infinite shots." Hara had been trained to wait for the exact moment. Japanese doctrine taught that precision trumped volume. But there, in the face of the American logistical colossus, this logic imploded. "We hit more," he admitted, "but you hit enough, and you kept shooting." It was the surrender of an idea. Japan had not lost to American error. He had lost to the ability to make mistakes without consequences. Other officials have come to the same conclusion. Takejiro Onishi, the mastermind of the kamikaze attacks, wrote in his diary, "We turned men into bombs because we had no more bombs." The confession wasn't just moral, it was mathematical. Japan was forced to replace raw materials with human flesh. What was lacking in capsules, they tried to make up for in courage. But there was no substitute for aluminum, copper, steel, gunpowder. Ugaki, another veteran admiral, revealed in his closing testimony that American factories seemed to reproduce ships as if they were toys. The Japanese astonishment was not in the defeat, it was in the scale of the defeat, in the fact that it didn't matter how hard you fought, the opponent always brought more, and this changed the meaning of the war. It's no longer a duel of honor, it became a refueling race. The Battle of Midway, so celebrated as a turning point, gained a new reading in post-war interrogation rooms. What defeated Japan? There was not only the torpedo boats, but the air logistics that supplied them. American planes took off rearmed in minutes, the Japanese in hours. The Japanese hangars operated with manually coupled pumps. The Americans used hydraulic systems. It was a difference of seconds, multiplied by hundreds of planes, at dozens of bases. It was time converted into fire. When Allied interrogators showed captured officers' ammunition production records, silence was greater than any lament. The table was objective. In 1944, the US produced 36 billion small-caliber cartridges. Japan has not reached even 5% of this. For many officers, that number was the end, the number that cannot be fought. "We should have lost earlier," Commander Nishi confessed in a low voice upon seeing the data. "It would have saved lives." The war had become unjust, but not out of cruelty, by excess. The phrase that was repeated the most in the testimonies was simple, almost childish. They had more capsules, more planes, more substitutes. And each American mistake was diluted in millions of hits, while every Japanese mistake was irrecoverable. The American margin of failure was greater than the Japanese margin of victory, and that transformed the battlefield. American strategists knew they could make mistakes and still win. That changed everything. The planning, the boldness, the rhythm changed. The Japanese, on the contrary, had to be perfect, always, because their margin was zero. Any failure was terminal, any expenditure was irreversible. And even so, they fought. This may be the last lesson of these reports. Not technical victory, but persistence in the face of the inevitable. Japan knew it was losing, and yet it kept going. Was it courage? Was it denial? Was it discipline? Maybe all of it. But it was also an absence of choice. When war becomes a statistic, the soldier becomes a given, and there is no honor that wins tables. In the next part, we'll delve into the anatomy of this invisible superiority. How American logistics worked in layers, redundant, anticipatory, ruthless. We'll reveal the behind-the-scenes of convoys that crossed oceans like metallic arteries, refueling fleets before they felt thirsty. Because for the United States, winning was no surprise. It was planning. And for Japan, resisting was already a miracle. When the imperial government decreed the requisition of metals, thousands of Buddhist temples were forced to turn over their centuries-old bells to the military foundry. The gesture, symbolic and brutal, resonated throughout the archipelago as an ancestral lament. The bells, shaped centuries ago to mark time, meditate and celebrate harmony, were transformed into capsules. An average bell, with its sacred inscriptions and devotional ornaments, could yield enough copper for 2,000 small-caliber bullets. It was the final conversion, from the sacred to the destructive. But even that was not enough. Because, on the other side, a single American destroyer could drop those same 2,000 capsules in less than 5 minutes, during a simple exercise, not a battle. The arithmetic of war had swallowed Japan's soul. Statues, locks, candlesticks, doorknobs, works of art and household items disappeared from the cities. Everything turned into copper, bronze, aluminum. Children were trained to identify recyclable metals. Teachers encouraged students to bring objects from home for national defense. But every gesture, every sacrifice was swallowed up by the distance that the numbers imposed. The entire nation was reconfiguring itself to feed a machine that could never reach the speed of the adversary. In Hiroshima, monks witnessed the disappearance of bells with almost 1,000 years of history. Parts that survived earthquakes, feudal wars, and fires, now ground and cast under bureaucratic orders. When asked about the pain of this loss, one monk replied, "We didn't feel like it was sacrifice, it was prayer." And yet, it was not enough. Because the war that Japan was waging was different. It wasn't just against tanks and fleets. It was against a model of civilization where volume replaced virtue, and in this model, capsules spoke louder than temples. While Japan burned its memory to produce ammunition, the US managed excess. In 1944, projectiles not used in exercises were discarded because they were out of visual standard, thousands of them every month. There was too much ammunition, even by American standards. A projectile with a slight imperfection in the paint or in the crimping of the case was rejected, although still functional. This type of pattern was only possible because there was abundance. Because the United States could afford to choose not to use it, while Japan melted relics to be able to shoot once more. It is in this contrast that irony reaches its cruelest point. The culture that prized silence, ceremony, aesthetic discipline, was forced to feed a war machine that demanded the opposite: noise, repetition, industrial brutality. And in the end, everything that was noble was destroyed to produce the banal. Bells did not save ships. The merged temples did not hinder Midway, nor Guadalcanal, nor Okinawa. The war, by demanding sacrifice, did not give anything back. It only showed that there are wars in which giving everything is not enough. In letters rescued from Japanese soldiers, there are direct mentions of this. One gunner wrote to his mother, "Today I shot 4 times, 4 bullets. One of them was made from the bell of our village temple." The phrase was not a metaphor. It was literal. The capsule he fired had been molded from the metal of his own childhood. Each shot was a piece of home. Each impact, a noise that erased what was most intimate and the most tragic. The enemy did not even notice this sacrifice. For the Americans, it was just another burst, a workout, a number on a schedule. The cultural destruction of Japan was not planned. It was a consequence of the desperate attempt to convert everything into ammunition. But even as it delivered the oldest symbols of its faith, Japan remained behind, because the opponent did not depend on sacrifices. It depended on the system. While the Japanese delivered bells, the Americans manufactured new castings. While some melted the past, others shaped the future. Japan struggled with what it had. The United States struggled with what it could repeat. And at that point, the war ceased to be combat and became a mirror. A mirror in which Japan saw itself not as a power in arms, but as a people trying to turn memories into ammunition. A spiritual society forced to act like an industrial civilization and failing. Because it is not enough to melt the temple. It is necessary to know how to merge its structure in rhythm, in precision, in scale. And Japan has never mastered this. In the next part, we'll show how, while Japan was mired in scarcity and tragic symbolism, the United States was already operating invisible logistics chains, supply systems that predicted failures, anticipated demands, and delivered ammunition before it was even requested. It was the triumph of the invisible, because sometimes the capsule that decides a war is not the one that is fired. It is the one that is already ready when the next battle begins. In 1944, aboard the USS Fletcher, an American gunner reported, "We expended more ammunition on the morning patrol than the Japanese did in an entire battle." The phrase was not bravado, it was protocol. On average, each American ship received complete replenishment of ammunition every 3 days. Even in active combat zones, there was a logistical system that tracked each ship, calculated consumption, and anticipated the need for resupply even before the formal order. The sailors knew they could make mistakes. They knew that if one salvo failed, there would be another and another. This created an unusual moral, an operational trust where initiative was rewarded, not punished. Shooting wasn't a dilemma. It was a right guaranteed by factories thousands of miles away. It was the certainty that whoever pulled the trigger would not be punished for daring. On the other side of the Pacific, psychology was different. Captain Kuroshima of the Imperial Japanese Navy wrote in his diary, "The problem is not aiming, it's deciding if it's worth pulling the trigger." The shortage of ammunition was so severe that sailors and pilots underwent instruction sessions on fire economy. In simulations, they learned to calculate whether the probability of hitting justified the use of ammunition. It wasn't technical training, it was psychological conditioning. Each shot needed to be rationalized as an irreversible good. The act of shooting was accompanied by guilt and often regret. This difference shaped combat behavior. American sailors advanced with the certainty of support. Japanese pilots hesitated in the face of doubt. With each unsuccessful shot, the Japanese soldier knew he had diminished the chances of the next attack. This conscience corroded morality invisibly. Weapons that were supposed to inspire confidence became reminders of the limit. The cannon was a clock that counted not the time, but the remaining shots. On Okinawa, Japanese gunners reported going a week without ammunition. When it finally arrived, it came in reused boxes, with capsules of varying calibers, many of them rusty. Some did not even have the manufacturing seal. The Americans, in turn, kept regulatory stockpiles on nearby islands, with ammunition separated by type, destination, purpose, and expiration. A single supply base like Ulithi stored more than 100,000 tons of ammunition, enough to sustain 3 entire fleets for weeks. It was not just a material advantage, it was moral engineering. The psychology of abundance creates boldness. A pilot who knows he will be able to refuel attacks more aggressively. A commander who knows he can make mistakes tries more often. The American victory in the Pacific was not just the result of technological superiority. It was the result of a mindset shaped by logistical trust. Those who know they can make mistakes without punishment win by repetition, and this repetition was unstoppable. Each Hellcat carried 650 machine guns and, on average, 2,400 rounds per mission. In a formation of 24 planes, this meant almost 60,000 bullets crossing the sky in minutes. The doctrine was not to aim at the target, it was to saturate the space. And even when 90% of the shots hit nothing, there was no negative consequence, because the important thing was not the individual hit, it was the permanence of the fire. The enemy, seeing the sky filled with projectiles, hesitated, retreated, or died trying to cross. The dominance came from the feeling of inevitability. On the Japanese side, this feeling was reversed. Every takeoff was a gamble. There were documented cases of planes taking off with incomplete ammunition or with improvised training capsules as live ammunition. And when they returned without success, the pilots wrote reports apologizing for having consumed projectiles without making an impact. The fear of making mistakes was as intense as the fear of dying, and sometimes bigger. This psychological asymmetry was recognized even by Americans. A naval intelligence report noted, "The hesitant behavior of Japanese forces reflects not only losses, but a growing realization that they cannot sustain combat." American doctrine itself began to exploit this weakness, launching attacks with the sole objective of forcing the enemy to expend ammunition, exhaust before engaging, destroy the ability to fight before direct confrontation. Japan has not only lost its ability to produce, he lost the belief that he could keep up the pace. Scarcity has shaped soldiers' tactics, manuals, planning. Everything started to revolve around the question, is this shot worth it? And by the time the war reaches that point, the enemy has already won, even before the first shot hits. In the next part, we will dive into the moment when this inequality ceased to be invisible, when the Japanese admirals themselves, after surrendering, confessed that they did not lose to men, but to factories. And like a spiritual war, it was swallowed up by a production schedule, because in the end, the battlefield wasn't on Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. It was at the pace of the hydraulic presses in Ohio. By the end of the war, the Imperial Navy had not only lost its ships, he had lost his doctrine, his logic, and above all, his faith. The collapse came not with surrender, but with the silence of the cannons that never fired. Hara's phrase, "Americans fired without thinking, we thought without shooting," ceased to be a tactical lament and became the epitaph of an era. American industrial supremacy won not only by quantity, but by the ability to transform iron into confidence, gunpowder into permanence, and capsules into strategic command. The US imposed a war that required no precision, only repetition. And against this model, Japan has discovered that courage does not compensate for lack, and that faith is no substitute for supply. The great lesson of this journey is brutal in its simplicity. Whoever controls the logistics shapes the strategy. Who shapes the strategy defines the end. It was not the bravery of the kamikaze pilots that shocked American strategists. It was the fact that they had no other option. And in the end, what seemed like honor was mathematical despair. Zemu Toyoda bitterly summed up what the whole of Japan learned too late. We were not defeated by soldiers. We were defeated by factories. And if this phrase causes discomfort, it is because it lays bare a truth that still echoes in modern conflicts. Thank you for following this deep analysis of the war through the eyes of the ammunition. If you value this type of research and historical reconstruction with real data and sources, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This strengthens our work and keeps alive the search for the truth behind the scenes in the military. Tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking data of this video? How much can a capsule reveal about the fate of a nation? And ring the bell. The next story we're going to tell you is just as devastating. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, Logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.